Okay, I think we might make a start. Ko te kai a te rangatira he kōrero, he mihi nui ki te mana whenua, he mihi nui ki a Gina Cole, te kaitohi manuhiri ki tēnei kōrero. He mihi nui ki a koutou katoa e tai mai nei ki te tautoko i tēnei kaupapa. Whakarongo, whakaaro, ako te matauranga e haere mai nei. Nō reirei te whānau, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou, ko Simi taku ingoa. My name's Simi and I'm the chair of the Same But Different board. I'd like to really warmly welcome everyone here who's turned up online to listen to this session. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Gina Cole. I always think it's really hard to sum someone up in a brief introductory blurb, and I think for Gina this is definitely true, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Gina's an award-winning writer, a former lawyer, an activist, and a former board member and supporter of Same But Different. She won the Best First Book Award in the 2017 Ockham NZ Book Awards for her story collection Black Ice Matter, and her forthcoming sci-fi fantasy novel Na Viro is a work of Pasifika futurism. Gina's someone to me who always seems to be taking on a new challenge, and she never ceases to amaze me. And that's why I was particularly thrilled that she agreed to deliver the Peter Wells lecture today. This lecture was named in memory of Same But Different's late founder, writer and activist Peter Wells, and it's a provocation. Just before we start, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, Creative New Zealand, the Rule Foundation, Auckland Pride, Rainbow New Zealand Charitable Trust, and all those supporters from our own communities, including our own board who volunteer their time and expertise. This festival just wouldn't be possible without all your support and sponsorship. So he mihi nui ki a koutou. If you have any questions during Gina's session, just pop them into the chat, and time permitting, we'll relay them to her at the end of the lecture. We'll be finishing at 5 to 6 to allow time for the next session, which starts at 6 o'clock, and that's our online book launch. So for now, I can hand over to Gina, who will be discussing the legacy of LGBTQI+ writing, the role it has to play in queer liberation, and who gets to write the narrative. Thank you, Gina.
Kia ora, Simi. Thank you for that introduction. He uri o whiti tēnei, no ngā mautere o Serua me ono I lau. Tēnā koutou katoa, ni Sambulavanaka, ma lolelei, talofa lava, warm Pacific greetings. It is a privilege to speak to you today. Thank you very much for joining me in this Zoom session. Thank you again to Simi and to the Same But Different board. Thank you for the provocation you have given me for this lecture, which is to discuss the legacy of LGBTQI+ writing, the role it has to play in queer liberation, and who gets to write the narrative. There is a lot to unpack in that. I have taken an angle that celebrates all of us queer writers who have historically and are currently writing our own narrative. To give the Same But Different Peter Wells lecture is an honour, to respect the legacy not only of Peter himself, but also of the writers who have preceded me in giving this annual address, including Georgina Bayer, who delivered the first lecture at the 2019 Same But Different Festival, Charmaine Poutney, who delivered the lecture in 2020, and Cassie Hartendorp, who delivered the lecture last year in 2021. I'd also like to acknowledge that yesterday, the 18th of February, marked the 3rd anniversary of Peter's passing, and I'm sure he would be proud that this festival is still going strong. A little bit about me. I trained as a lawyer and I practiced law for 27 years. For most of that time, I was a barrister specialising in family law. I closed my legal practice in 2018 to complete a PhD in creative writing at Massey University. And I graduated last year in 2021. Since then, I have been working as a freelance writer, reviewer, assessor. I am on the editorial board of Headland Online Literary Journal, and I'm a board member of Silo Theatre Trust. I have a book, my second book is coming out in July this year, and it is a novel titled Na Viro, which means whirlpool in Fijian. And I will talk more about that later. I'm also working on my third book. In this lecture, I will use Indigenous Pasifika wayfinding principles of oceanic navigation as a metaphorical framing device, and I will explain what I mean by that very briefly. I will then speak about some queer literary publications in the past and the role they played in queer liberation in Aotearoa. I will also talk about the queer literary environment today, including the continuing presence of the same but different festival, which in my view provides a safe harbour for the queer literary fleet. And finally, I will make some observations about what future queer literary destinations we may be drawing towards ourselves from beyond the horizon. The Indigenous Pasifika science of celestial navigation or wayfinding is how my ancestors navigated in drua or waka haurua or double-hulled waka across the Pacific Ocean. Traditional wayfinding techniques and waka building have undergone a resurgence since 1976, when the Hawaiian-built double-hulled wa'akaulua Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti along ancient voyaging routes without the aid of Western instruments. I will use wayfinding principles as a framing device in my address to you today and as a way of talking about the past, present, and future of queer writing in Aotearoa. I think this maritime metaphor is appropriate since we are geographically located in the Pacific Ocean. This is where we live, and this is where I come from. Te moana nui a kiwa, the vast Pacific Ocean. The concept of the va is a very interesting one, and a lot has been written about it. Albert Wendt's definition of the va is the space between, the betweenness, not empty space that separates, but space that relates, that holds separate entities and things together in the unity that is all, the space that is context, giving meaning to things. Accordingly, va can denote the space between two people, or two islands, or two planets, and in Pasifika culture, it is a space that needs to be nurtured and cared for. Lana Lopesi, in her recent book, Bloody Women, talks about the artist Rosanna Raymond's articulation of va as, quote, the active state of space between an artist and the audience. In accordance with this definition, I want to look at the queer literary va as an active state of space between a writer and a reader, where there is a connection and a relationship. We don't usually see our world, planet Earth, represented from this point of view, even though the Pacific covers 1/3 of the planet. It is our home, it is home to thousands of islands and Pasifika peoples. It is the largest continent on Earth, the blue continent. Because we live in this vast Pacific Ocean, I want to shift our perspective into an oceanic metaphor as a way of talking about queer writing in Aotearoa. I imagine queer writing in Aotearoa as a fleet of numerous literary waka and LGBTQI+ and MVP FAFF writers as the navigators of those literary waka through the va of the literary environment. And here I want to acknowledge Felicia Brown-Acton, who coined the term MVP FAFF to enhance Indigenous Pasifika queer gender diversity awareness, using words which are pre-colonial expressions of gender diversity in people who have non-heteronormative lifestyles. We are people who have important roles to play in Indigenous Pasifika culture. The acronym MVP FAFF includes Mahu from Tahiti, Wakasalewalewa from Fiji, Whakawhiwhine from Niue, Pinapinaine from Kiribati and Tuvalu, Akavaine from the Cook Islands, Whawhawhine from Samoa, and Whakaleiti from Tonga. Before colonization, we wrote our own texts in many ways, including weaving, tatau, masi, tapa, song, dance, waka building, and wayfinding navigation, just to name a few of the mediums or cultural practices in which we, Indigenous Pasifika peoples, expressed ourselves and read the environment and continue to do so today. We also use written text written in the English language. I consider that the queer literary fleet in Aotearoa consists of all queer writers and our work, and it seems clear to me that we can and we have and we continue to write our own narrative. I believe it comes down to us to write ourselves into existence in the literary canon, and I want to show you that historically we have done that and we are continuing to do so today. So how do we as queer writers navigate the literary space, the literary ocean, the literary va? Again, I want to use principles from the art of celestial navigation or wayfinding to search for some possible answers. In wayfinding, Indigenous Pacific Ocean navigators always maintain a connection with their point of departure. They maintain a mental map, which is continually updated in terms of time, distance, and bearing from the home reference point. Imagine your destination is an island on the horizon. You keep the island in your mind's eye, but you do not try to aim for it in a straight line. Rather, you continue to adjust to the signs in the world moving past you. You read the signs all around you, such as wind direction, swell patterns, currents, clouds, streaks of phosphorescence that indicate landmass, homing birds, and star paths. And you make any course corrections necessary to bring your future destination towards you. This may even take you on a long dogleg away from the island, but eventually the island comes closer and closer to you and the waka, and then it arrives. From the wayfinder's perspective, the island has come to you. In a sense, you, the navigator, and the vessel remain stationary for the purposes of navigation, and landfall eventually reaches you. Much like the legend of Maui, who fished up Te Ika a Maui, the North Island, from the sea and pulled it towards him. Using this metaphor, I suggest that as queer Aotearoan writers, we can remember our past and we can plot our own course when steering the queer literary waka, when steering our own writing. We can take into account all the signs available to us in the present literary environment to adjust our position whenever necessary, and we can draw our future literary destination to us. As Master Navigator Chief Larry Rigatel says, the first, last, and most important lesson of traditional celestial navigation, you must always know where your island is. You must know where you came from to know where you are going. So what are our past points of reference for New Zealand queer writing? We could start in the early to mid 20th century. We could start with Catherine Mansfield and her oceanic poem, given my oceanic kind of framework, The Secret, which she wrote for Ida Baker in about 1912 and speaks to their eternal relationship. The Secret. In the profoundest ocean, there is a rainbow shell. It is always there, shining most stilly under the great storm waves and under the happy little waves, and the old Greeks called ripples of laughter. And you listen, the rainbow shell sings in the profoundest ocean. It is always there, singing most silently. I think that poem speaks to how Ida Baker was always there in Mansfield's life, but I would also like to read it as a comment on how we queer writers are always here. James Courage is a New Zealand writer who wrote a novel called A Way of Love, published in 1959 in England, the first gay novel written by a New Zealander. A Way of Love is a love story about a younger man's relationship with an older man. It received a negative response in England and New Zealand and a vitriolic review in Landfall in June 1959. In 1961, the New Zealand Police brought the novel before the Interdepartmental Committee responsible for the censorship of indecent publications. The committee banned the novel on the grounds of indecency and because it lacked redeeming literary merit. However, in 1997, Peter Wells and Rex Pilgrim edited an anthology titled Best Mates, Gay Writing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they identified A Way of Love as New Zealand's first gay novel and praised it as a breakthrough novel for the silvery consciousness of the narrator and his insistence on honesty about his emotions and actions. Further into the 20th century, queer writers Frank Sargeson, James K. Baxter, Eric McCormack, Charles Brash, Bill Pearson, pretty much cisgendered male Pākehā landscape. The editors of the Out Here anthology, Chris C. and Emma Barnes, note that writers like Catherine Mansfield and James K. Baxter were never talked about in terms of their queerness when they were writing. It was only decades later when we were able to claim them. So these past New Zealand writers, queer writers, produced work in a time when queer writing was hidden within heteronormative and oppressive legal and social norms. It was there, but not very accessible and lacked visibility. And there was active erasure of queer content, whether it was by books being banned for indecency, or whether they were not published, or we were not acknowledged as queer, or whether it was the stereotyping of queer characters who were made the butt of jokes. That is not to say that this erasure and stereotyping isn't happening today, because it is. Jackson Newland, in their 2018 Pantagraph Punch article, talks about erasure still being an issue today. For instance, when you look at the lack of queer content in what is taught in schools, and whether the queer identity of a writer or the queer content of our work is even discussed when it is reviewed. So while we remember the past of queer writing in Aotearoa, which was not really that long ago, let's position ourselves in the present. What are the signs around us in the present queer literary environment? Given that the theme of this festival is legacy, I want to pay homage to Peter Wells and his literary legacy, as well as his vast body of literary work. This festival, Same Same But Different, is a huge part of the legacy that Peter has left for us in the present. My first book, Black Ice Matter, was published in 2016, which was the same year in which the first Same Same But Different festival took place. I remember the wonderful feeling of being in the company of other queer writers and readers. For me personally, and no doubt for many other queer writers, this festival is one easily identifiable reference point for queer writing in Aotearoa today. It is the first and only annual queer literary festival. It provides a kind of safe harbour for the queer literary fleet in Aotearoa. I have been a part of, and I have supported the Same Same But Different festival every year since 2013, either as a member of the audience or a board member or a participant. I know that Peter wanted this festival to be an inclusive space for all queer writers and readers, and a place where we can celebrate and discover our own voice. In the program for the first festival in 2016, Peter wrote, quote, "My hope is that Same Same But Different will introduce a heightened awareness of the timbre and reach of our voice, but also celebrate the richness inherent in difference," close quote. The Same Same But Different festival is certainly continuing to thrive and grow as a celebration of our different voices. And the festival has gone on to take place every year since 2016, including an online festival, 2 to the Power of 5, the Power of Queer Words, which was held in 2020, just after the first COVID-19 lockdown. I want to pay tribute to all the amazing people that have been part of the festival over the years and the incredible discussions and panels that have taken place. The very first panel of the first Same Same But Different festival in 2016 was called The Book That Turned the Light On. It was described as follows. Quote, in a past of illegality and stigma, books asserted a powerful presence. For LGBTQI people, they became an underground system of passing on information, ways of survival, and even sexual technique. A range of authors and well-known LGBTQI personalities talk about a particular book, from highbrow to trash porn, that turned the light on, close quote. The writers in that panel were Joanne Drayton, Victor Roger, Paula Bock, Douglas Lloyd Jenkins, Paul Diamond, Whaitiri Makaere, Susanna Walker, Michael Stevens, Jeremy Hansen, and Cole Myers, and the panel was chaired by Edward Cowley. I suggest to you, when you look at that lineup of writers, clearly we are writing our own narrative. That session, The Book That Turned the Light On, recognized the powerful presence of such books in our lives and gave us a place to talk about those books. What was the book that turned the light on for each of us? For me, I came out in 1983 when I was 23, and I was confused about my sexuality. There was a lot of political activity and protest happening at the time, including political activism around the Homosexual Law Reform Act, which was introduced into the House by Fran Wilde in 1985 and became law in 1986. The Act decriminalised sexual relations between men aged 16 and over. Lesbian sexual relations were not criminalised in New Zealand, but the absence of lesbian sex from criminal law did not mean that lesbian relationships were accepted. Women who transgressed accepted codes of behaviour and gender could still be punished. Young women who engaged in unacceptable sexual behaviour, including lesbian practices, could be sent to government institutions such as Te Oranga Girls' Home at Burwood in Christchurch, or we could be committed to psychiatric hospitals for treatment. Homosexuality was defined as a personality disorder by psychiatrists until 1973. The debate around the Homosexual Law Reform Act brought queer rights and queer issues into public discourse, and that discussion has been going on ever since, with the passage into law of the Civil Union Act in 2005, the same-sex marriage legislation in 2012, and the legislation that was passed just this week to ban conversion therapy. All of these landmark pieces of legislation have been victories for queer rights, but also those public discussions brought to the surface the bigotry and queer phobia and hypocrisy that still exists in our society. I don't know if the first lesbian book I read turned the light on, but it does have an interesting history. My first girlfriend was a Māori woman, and she knew I was struggling with my sexual identity. One day she handed me a book and said, "Here, read this. It's a bit depressing, but there are lesbians in it." And this was the book. The Well of Loneliness, published in 1928 and written by British lesbian Radcliffe Hall. The Well of Loneliness is about a woman named Stephen from an upper-class English family who is referred to in the book as a sexual invert, which is a euphemism for homosexual. Stephen realizes from a young age that she is attracted to women. She dresses in masculine clothes and falls in love with another woman while working as an ambulance driver in World War I. The novel portrays inversion, i.e. homosexuality, as a natural God-given state, and it ends with the sentence, "Give us the right to our existence." Radcliffe Hall is credited with popularizing the word invert, a word that was once confined to 19th century medical psychiatric texts, but it became a well-known word after the publication of The Well of Loneliness. There is no overt or sexually explicit language in the book. At its raciest, it goes no further than saying, "She kissed her full on the lips as a lover." And it goes on to describe a night of passion as, quote, "That night they were not divided," close quote. The book was seen as a corrupting threat to social order in England. In August 1928, the year of its publication, James Douglas, the editor of the Sunday Express, a right-wing British tabloid, led a campaign against the novel. He wrote in his paper, quote, "In order to prevent the contamination and corruption of English fiction, it is the duty of the critic to make it impossible for any other novelist to repeat this outrage. I say deliberately that this novel is not fit to be sold by any bookseller or to be borrowed from any library," close quote. In November 1928, The Well of Loneliness was the subject of an obscenity trial. Even though other novels with a lesbian theme were published in the same year, including Virginia Woolf's Orlando, The Well of Loneliness was the only one to be put to trial. It was banned in England under the Obscene Publications Act 1857 because the judge said it defended unnatural practices between women, and he ordered that the book be destroyed. Radcliffe Hall appealed the decision, but the appeal failed. The judge on appeal said, quote, "Put in a word, the view of this court is that this is a disgusting book when read properly. It is an obscene book and a book prejudicial to the morals of the community," close quote. But despite being banned in England, The Well of Loneliness went on to be published in the United States, and this book has never gone out of print. These are just some of the covers of the reprints over the years, and there are many others. The banning of the book in England in 1928 kind of backfired on the court and the people who opposed it because it made sexual inversion a subject of household conversation for the first time. The banning of the book drew so much attention to the very subject it was intended to suppress that it left British authorities wary of further attempts to censor books for lesbian content. It resulted in greater publicity about lesbianism than if there had been no prosecution at all. The book remained banned in England until 1959, when the Obscene Publications Act was amended to differentiate controversial works of art and literature with social merit. These are just a couple of pictures of Radcliffe Hall and her partner, Lady Una Troubridge. Radcliffe Hall is on the right in these pictures. A couple of upper-class British lesbians with their dogs, looking quite serious. Here they are again, looking a bit happier in this picture. Una Troubridge was also a writer and a sculptor. Between them, they left behind an archive of over 50 boxes of papers, which are currently being digitized by the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin, USA. The Harry Ransom Center is a research facility and archive of cultural legacy, which preserves literary and artistic collections from around the world and makes them accessible to researchers. Among those papers, researchers have discovered that at the time of its publication, The Well of Loneliness was supported by thousands of readers who wrote to Hall in outrage at the ban. One reader wrote, quote, "It has made me want to live and go on. I dreaded this thing, which I thought abnormal," close quote. One researcher has written, quote, "The letters demonstrated the public's awareness that The Well of Loneliness was not an obscene novel and that Hall had been unfairly and unjustly treated by the government and the media," close quote. I did read the book and it is really depressing. There is a lot of tragedy and shame in the story. It has been described as the most depressing lesbian novel ever written. I remember this book being handed around in the lesbian community in Auckland in the early 1980s as a sort of underground secret book written by a lesbian, about lesbians, for lesbians, even though it was written by an upper-class white British lesbian about upper-class white British lesbians in World War I, which was completely removed from my experience here in New Zealand as a Fijian lesbian woman and that of my Māori girlfriend. I don't think it turned on many lights for me, but what it did do was feed the hunger we all had for reading lesbian content. But I do not see this book as a reference point for the queer literary fleet in Aotearoa. Maybe you could say it was one of the tall ships from England. We have all searched out literature where we can see ourselves represented in some way, even if it is completely removed from our own experience in respect of physical, cultural, racial, or generational setting. Jackson Newland, in their article in the Pantagraph Punch in 2018, quotes queer Wellington poet Emma Barnes, who said that she started reading texts that weren't queer as a survival strategy. Newland says, if we lived in a world with equal representation, LGBTQI plus people wouldn't need these kinds of survival strategies. I agree with them, and I think that is why it is so important that we do write our own narrative, to feed that hunger for queer content and truth-telling in how we are represented in story. I wish that someone had given me Catherine Mansfield's poem, The Secret, with its oceans and waves and shells and rainbows, rather than The Well of Loneliness with its tragedy and shame. But without knowing it, I had already read a book by a queer writer which had a profound effect on me when I was 12 years old. And that book was Pounamu Pounamu by Witi Ihimaera, one of our shining stars in the queer literary firmament. Pounamu Pounamu was Witi Ihimaera's first book, and it was published 50 years ago in 1972. It was the first work of fiction published by a Māori writer, and it had a real influence on me. The writing spoke to me when I first read it as a 12-year-old. There is a story about kuia playing cards, which reminded me of my Fijian grandmother's playing cards. And there were so many other great stories. And I think my love of short stories grew from this one book. The breadth of Witi Ihimaera's writing is immense, including memoir, non-fiction, novels, anthologies, theatre pieces, and screenwriting. He is one of our kaumātua, and for me, he is one of our best queer literary navigators. My favourite panel at the 2016 festival was Witi Ihimaera in conversation with Paul Diamond. In this panel, Ihimaera talked about the 2014 publication of the first volume of his autobiography, Māori Boy, and about the process of writing memoir and recreating a self. The text for this panel stated, quote, as queer men and women, we often have to create a self in defiance of the heteronormative values which in the past presented us as stigmatized beings. Does memoir give you a chance to rewrite and rewrite the past? Witi talked about the process of memory, confronting taboos, the force of tikanga Māori, and how this might both inhibit and empower. Ihimaera has gone on to publish the second novel of his autobiography, Native Son, in 2019, and I have heard him say that he is working on the third volume, Indigenous Envoy. Another great panel from the festival in 2016 was titled Larger Than Life Stories with Alison Moore, Joanne Drayton, and Julie Glamazina, chaired by Carol Bew. And what I loved about that panel was that it talked about books that were written by New Zealand queers, about New Zealand queers, more present day reference points, our narratives, our stories by us, for us. Alison Moore talked about her first book, The First Lady, the story of Liz Roberts, who was the first New Zealander to undergo full sex change surgery in 1969. Joanne Drayton talked about her book, The Search for Anne Perry, a New York Times best-selling biography of Anne Perry, a celebrated crime writer and also, notoriously, one of the young women found guilty of murdering her girlfriend's mother in Christchurch in 1954. Julie Glamazina talked about her book, Perfectly Natural, which is the story of Iris Florence Williams, who was born female and lived as a man named Peter Williams in 20th century New Zealand. She was vilified for having her breasts removed for other than medical reasons. They lived as a man for 60 years and married at least 4 times They were prosecuted in 1945 in the Auckland Magistrates Court for marrying another woman. Again, this panel showed me that we are writing our own narrative. And of course, given my maritime theme, another one of my favourite panels at the 2016 festival was called Paddling Your Own Waka, a session that looked at the possibilities and problems of finding your own audience, setting up our publishing houses and bookshops, and digital self-publishing. Also in the 2016 festival was a panel mashup of readings from new voices and established writers, a panel called Teenage Years, where two teenagers gave a performance of I Am Sure, and historian Chris Brickell talked about his book, Mates and Lovers, The History of Teenagers in New Zealand and the Social Pressure on Queer Youth. And Stephen Aldred Grigg talked about his personal history as a teenager in the 1960s in New Zealand. Another 2016 panel titled #The Future featured LGBTQI talent shaking up the theatre scene in New Zealand. Victor Roger, author of the play Black Faggot, talked to screenwriters and playwrights, including award-winning playwright, screenwriter, and journalist Aroha Awaro, Sam Brooks, who was named Auckland's most exciting playwright by Metro magazine, Nathan Joe, a playwright whose play Like Sex was being developed for the 2016 Young and Hungry Festival of New Theatre, Amanaki Prescott Falato, who won Playmarket's Best Play for the Young as co-writer of Inky Pinky Ponky, and Josephine Tefew, an actor, columnist, and author of 3 plays. I say again, we are writing our own narrative. The writers that were featured in that first Same But Different festival in 2016 certainly gave me vital reference points in the queer literary environment. There are, of course, many other queer literary, queer Aotearoan writers in the present queer literary environment, some of whom have appeared in Same But Different festivals and some who have not, including Kathy Dunsford, Pat Rosier, Jess Sayer, Stella Duffy, Anna Marie Jagos, Kerry Hume, Heather McPherson, Renee, Ngahuia Te Awa Kotaku, and many others. In 2019, the Academy of New Zealand Literature published an online article titled, Why Aren't You Reading Queer? To celebrate the 4th Same But Different festival as the only annual LGBTQI+ Writers Festival in New Zealand. The Academy suggested over 20 contemporary New Zealand books, either written by queer writers or with queer content, or both, published between 1995 and 2018, including works by queer writers Chris C., Hera Lindsay Bird, Hine Moana Baker. I was also included in this list, and so was Courtney Sena Meredith, who is our honoured writer this year. So what does the queer literary fleet look like at this very moment, the 19th of February 2022? Who are our queer literary navigators? What is the state of the queer literary environment today? And what is the role that we play in queer liberation? I refer to a quote from Cassie Hartendorp in an interview with Sue Bradford in 2016, where she states, quote, "The thing I love about queer spaces is that people I have known to be radical within these communities are often the embodiment of what a transformed society could be. They are not afraid to push the boundaries around how they live and exist in the world. To me, that's inspiring, an openness to different ways of being transformative. What I've learned from engaging with the queer community is how to creatively push our political thinking out and be willing to look for new ways of addressing old problems," close quote. I think that idea of creatively pushing out political thinking encapsulates really well the role that queer writers play in queer liberation. And when you look around at the queer literary environment in 2022, it is clear that we are continuing to push political thinking in our writing, and we are continuing to write our own narrative. There are many signs and lots of fabulous currents of swirling phosphorescence in our present queer literary environment to guide us. And again, I look to this festival to prove my point. We are writing poetry and performing at open mics. We are writing plays and reading scripts. We are performers. We are actors and directors and producers. We write flash fiction and short fiction and work in the community. We are writing comedy and rap songs. We are journalists and science fiction writers. We are essayists and peddlers of horny fiction and novelists and spoken word poets. We are narrative therapists. We write articles. We write the hard stuff. We honor our writers. We write children's books and genre-bending books. We write about racism and sexism and draw on our roots. We are magazine editors. We write novels and hold book launches. We write lectures. We are broadcasters and museum directors and write columns in magazines. We are taonga puoro practitioners. We write about our ancestors. We write for anthologies. We edit anthologies. We write feel-good, fast-paced novels and appear in online Zoom sessions. We are graphic novelists and bloggers. We run zine workshops and make them available online. We watch live streams. In the eternal present, there are many queer literary navigators steering many queer waka in Aotearoa. In my own present experience, I was recently given this book, edited by historian and gender studies professor Chris Brickell, titled James Courage Diaries, published in 2021, where I came across the word invert once again. I read that James Courage wrote in one of his diaries, quote, "All my life I shall fight against the unwritten, senseless, cruel law that brands sexual inverts as degenerates and beasts," close quote. Of course, that brought me full circle back to Radcliffe Hall and her popularising of the word invert. But it is because of Chris Brickell's work as a historian that we have this queer history to read about in the present. Also in our queer present literary environment, I have to mention this fabulous book, Out Here, an anthology of Takatapui and LGBTQIA+ writers from Aotearoa, which I'm honoured to be a part of, and I won't talk about it too much because there is a Zoom session coming up later on tonight about this book. But I just want to acknowledge this anthology and the beautiful cover, which has been described in a recent review by Andrew Paul Wood as follows, quote, "A substantial hardback in gay pinks and lesbian lavenders, the magenta cyan combination known as bisexual lighting in YouTuber circles, in a motif of wet oil paint that you kind of want to move around with a brush," close quote. There is much to celebrate in the present moment in queer writing. These books were all published in the last 12 months. 30 Queer Lives, Conversations with LGBTQIA+ New Zealanders by Matt McAvoy, published in February 2022 by Massey University Press. A Queer Existence, The Lives of Young Gay Men in Aotearoa, New Zealand by Mark Beer, published in September 2021. And Ku Rangai Tuku by Whiti Heriaka, published in November 2021 by Huia Publishers. In a review and spin-off, Esa May Ranapiri described the main character of Karangai Tuku as follows. Karangai Tuku is unambiguously queer and perhaps ambiguously a woman and definitely a storyteller. Ranapiri also wrote, "I just want to say this book has some of the hottest gay sex I've ever read. Turns out when shit isn't written by straight men, lesbian love can flourish." So what of the future? Where are we heading and what destination do we wish to draw towards us? While queer literary writers and queer content is certainly being published in the present time, there also remains a lot of work to do in the political sphere. There are still many legislative changes that are needed to protect us. For instance, the Births, Deaths and Marriages Relationships Registration Bill was passed with unanimous support from all political parties on the 9th of December 2021, a victory for trans, non-binary and Takatapui people, which allows those who need to amend their birth certificate to do so without going through the family court. but it only applies to people who have a New Zealand birth certificate. So there is still a need to provide a solution for people born overseas, including refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. There are also calls to change the outdated adoption law in New Zealand under the Adoption Act 1955. In 2016, the Human Rights Review Tribunal set out several provisions that are inconsistent with the Bill of Rights Act, including the inability of civil union partners or same-sex de facto couples to adopt. In the wider Pacific region, there are 7 countries and 1 territory where homosexuality is currently criminalized: the Cook Islands, Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Niue, which is part of the realm of New Zealand. Homosexuality was only decriminalized in Nauru in 2016. These laws criminalizing homosexual conduct are a direct legacy of British colonialism and were imported to support colonial control and morality. While this encoded legacy of homophobia is traceable to colonization, our leaders and religious institutions continue to make statements that entrench discrimination towards LGBTQI+ people. For example, even though Fiji gave sexual and gender minorities protection against discrimination in the Constitution, Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama made pejorative public statements about lesbians when marriage equality was achieved in the United States in 2016. In response to calls for same-sex marriage in Fiji, Bainimarama slammed same-sex marriage as rubbish and advised same-sex couples to move to Iceland and stay there if they wanted marriage equality. In April 2019, Tongan rugby player Israel Folau revealed a fundamentalist streak that has hijacked Pacific cultures and Christianity when he posted on Instagram that hell awaited unrepentant gay people. And in November 2019, he delivered a religious sermon in which he claimed that the horrific bushfires in Australia were God's judgment for same-sex marriage and abortion. So yes, there is still work to do to protect queer people in the Pacific and to allow us to be who we are. Daniel Heath Justice, an Indigenous gay scholar of the Cherokee Nation, says, quote, "We can't possibly live otherwise unless we first imagine otherwise," close quote. This sentiment is echoed by Albert Wendt, who said in relation to Pacific artists, quote, "We need to write, paint, sculpt, weave, dance, sing, and think ourselves into existence. We have to write our own stories," close quote. For myself, I am a science fiction nerd. My PhD research was focused on Indigenous science fiction, particularly Māori and Pasifika science fiction. And what I found is that there is not a huge amount of science fiction fantasy by Pasifika authors. So I took Toni Morrison's advice when she said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So I have written a science fiction fantasy novel titled Na Viro, meaning whirlpool in Fijian, with Pasifika characters in a genre which I call Pasifika futurism. The main character in the novel is a Fijian, Tongan, Majuran woman who is a spaceship captain and navigator. She lives in a floating village in the Pacific. She can navigate waka on the Pacific Ocean, and she uses that skill in her navigation of spaceships in space. Of course, we can be in space. We are celestial navigators. So the destination I am currently drawing towards myself is the launch of my book, Na Viro, hopefully in July this year, COVID willing. In conclusion, I think we all have our own home-based reference points when we set out on a writing journey. We can creatively push out political thinking, constantly updating and reading the signs in the present time and place, and drawing our future literary destination to us, even though that destination may be out of sight below the horizon. Whatever future destination you are drawing towards yourself, I wish you happy sailing. Thank you for listening. Ngā mihi.
Wow, thank you, Gina. I'm actually a little bit speechless right now, and I can see everyone else's because there's like no questions in the chat, just like really lots of capital letters and excitement going on there. That was so incredible. And I think that I love your idea of like drawing a literary future destination to us. And I feel like there's a whole lot of hope in that. And you've really delivered this sort of future, past and present of queer writing in Aotearoa. And I think if there's anyone that's imagined her writing into existence, I think that award goes to you. I know we're going to all be looking forward to reading your new book, Na Viro, and I'm just so impressed that you've already started your third book. Incredible. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us today. Please jump on for our final 2 sessions, and don't forget we've got another session on Sunday at 11. So once again, thank you, Gina. I was actually smiling and laughing for so much of your lecture, and Sam was texting me furiously saying, I'm in tears. So, you know, I think everyone has had a huge response there. And I'll just end, so we finish on time. Obviously, kia tau te aroha me te atawhai e runga i a tātou katoa e te mutinga o tō tātou hui e ngā wā katoa. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.